Chapter 1. The morning the bells went silent Christmas came to St. Mary Mead the way it always did, quietly, decorously, as though the village itself had rehearsed the occasion every year for a century, and saw no reason to deviate now. Snow had fallen in the night, not the dramatic sweeping kind that novelists preferred, but a soft, deliberate snowfall, the sort that settled on window ledges and garden walls and muffled the sound of the world until everything felt slightly unreal. By 5 in the morning the lanes were white, and the church tower was wearing its seasonal cap of frost, and the whole village looked precisely like the front of a Christmas card that someone's maiden aunt might send. Miss Jane Marple woke at 6:30, as she always did, without alarm. She lay still for a moment beneath the heavy eiderdown, listening. The room was cold. The fire had gone out in the night, and she could see her breath misting faintly in the dim grey light that crept around the edges of the curtains. Outside a robin was singing. She had always found robins rather admirable. They were cheerful regardless of circumstance. There was something deeply sensible about that. She dressed carefully, as she always did, taking her time with buttons that her fingers found less cooperative than they once had. Arthritis was an indignity, but then, so was a great many things that came with age. Miss Marple had learned over the course of 80-some years that indignities were best met with patience and a certain deliberate cheerfulness. She had her breakfast, boiled egg, 2 slices of toast, a pot of Earl Grey strong enough to be useful, and then sat by the window with her knitting, watching the village come awake. It was at precisely 10 minutes past 9 that she heard the scream. It was not the theatrical kind of scream, not the drawn-out wail that people produced in amateur dramatic productions when pretending to discover a body. It was shorter than that, sharper, the kind of sound that escapes before a person has time to decide whether screaming is appropriate. Miss Marple set down her knitting at once. She had heard screams before. She had a reasonably good sense of the different varieties, and this one, the brevity of it, the quality of genuine shock rather than performed horror, told her something had gone very wrong indeed at Hartley House. Hartley House stood at the far end of Church Lane, separated from the village proper by a stretch of stone wall and a row of horse chestnuts that were magnificent in summer and skeletal now. It was one of the older houses in St. Mary Mead, Georgian, built of warm yellowish stone, with sash windows and a fanlight above the front door that had never, in Miss Marple's recollection, been adequately cleaned. Colonel Reginald Hartley had lived there for nearly 30 years. His wife, Eleanor, had lived there rather longer than she'd intended, or so the village privately believed. Miss Marple put on her coat, her hat, her good warm gloves, and her sensible boots. Then she wound her scarf twice around her neck. The morning was sharp, and walked up Church Lane at a pace that might have surprised people who assumed elderly ladies moved slowly out of infirmity rather than choice. The front door of Hartley House was standing open. This struck her immediately as wrong. One did not leave front doors open on a December morning, not in England, not even in extremis. The fact that someone had failed to close it suggested either great distress or great carelessness, and Miss Marple rather suspected the former. She let herself in, as she had done many times before. She had been a regular visitor, or at least an occasional one, invited for Christmas drinks and summer garden parties with the regularity that passes for friendship in English villages. The hallway was cold, the overhead lights still off, the only illumination coming from the sitting room at the end of the passage, where a fire had been laid and lit earlier that morning. She could hear voices, 2 of them, low and fractured, the sound of people trying to speak coherently, when what they really wanted to do was nothing of the kind. She found them in the sitting room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, as it had for the last 20 years at least. A large noble fur, beautifully decorated, every ornament placed with the kind of precision that suggested Eleanor Hartley's personal supervision. Beneath it, in the half-dark of the winter morning with the fairy lights still blinking their cheerful and utterly oblivious blue and gold, lay Colonel Reginald Hartley. He was on his back. One hand was extended above his head, and in that hand, loosely, as though he had merely been holding it and then decided not to, was the broken half of a glass ornament, a deep crimson bauble with a crack running clean across it. His face was, and this was the detail that Miss Marple's mind caught and held, turning it over the way one turns over a stone to see what lives underneath. Peaceful. More than peaceful. There was a very faint expression about his lips that might, in another context, have been interpreted as satisfaction. Eleanor Hartley was standing with her back to the fireplace, both hands pressed flat against her sternum, as though she were physically holding herself together. She was 61 years old, gray-haired, fine-boned, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had spent decades learning how not to react. Beside her, his hand hovering near her arm with the uncertainty of a man who is not sure whether comfort will be welcome, stood Reverend Thomas Aldgate. "He's dead," Eleanor said, when she saw Miss Marple. Her voice was steady. Steadier, Miss Marple thought, than it perhaps should have been. "Reginald is dead." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I rather thought he might be. Has Dr. Haverford been called?" "I telephoned him just now," said Reverend Aldgate. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, lean-faced, with thoughtful eyes, and the hands of someone who spent a great deal of time pressing them together. "He's on his way. And the police. I telephoned the police as well." He paused. "I thought it was the right thing to do, given the circumstances." "The circumstances?" Miss Marple said pleasantly. "He has been unwell," Eleanor said, with a precision that landed oddly. "His heart, of course," said Miss Marple. She did not say what she was thinking. She rarely did at this early stage. But she was thinking, while she stood quite still and absorbed everything about the room, the tree, the body, the broken ornament, the particular quality of the silence between the two living people. She was thinking that she had known a man very like Colonel Hartley once. Many years ago, a man who had also been found on a floor with a peaceful expression that did not quite match the circumstances. That man had not died of natural causes either. She did not say this. She folded her hands, looked with mild blue eyes at Eleanor Hartley, and waited for what would come next, because something always came next. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, the first few minutes after a body was discovered were among the most informative of any investigation. People said things they had not planned to say. They moved in ways that revealed things they had spent years concealing. The body on the floor was the past. The living people in the room, they were the story. And so she waited and she watched, while outside the robin continued to sing, and the snow continued to lie in its silent white innocence across Church Lane, and inside the house, behind the careful faces of the people who had known Reginald Hartley best, the truth began, very slowly, to make its first cautious movements toward the surface. Chapter 2. The household assembled. Dr. Frederick Haverford arrived at Hartley House at 9:47, which was rather faster than anyone had expected, given that he lived on the other side of the village and the lane would have been treacherous with ice. He was a compact, careful man of 55, with a grayish moustache and the slightly harassed expression of a country doctor who has been called out on Christmas morning before he has finished his breakfast. He examined Colonel Hartley briskly, asked several questions in a low voice, and then straightened up and said that it appeared to be cardiac arrest. "Appeared to be?" said Miss Small from her position near the window. Dr. Haverford looked at her. He had been a resident of St. Mary Mead for 12 years, which was long enough to have learned certain things about Miss Marple among them that her questions, however sweetly phrased, were never casual. "The colonel had a heart condition," he said carefully. "He'd been on medication for 18 months. This is not entirely unexpected." "No," said Miss Marple. "I suppose it isn't. The police arrived shortly after. Constable Webb, young and earnest with snow on his shoulders, followed 20 minutes later by Detective Inspector Harold Craddock, who had driven over from Downminster and seemed faintly put out to have been called away from his own Christmas. Craddock was a solid, methodical man, not given to imagination, which Miss Marple had always felt was both his greatest professional virtue and his most significant limitation. He spoke to Eleanor, to the vicar, to the doctor, took several notes, examined the body with the businesslike air of a man who has already decided what he is looking at, and then said it appeared to be death by natural causes. Miss Marple said nothing. She had found, over the years, that saying nothing was frequently more productive than saying something. By 11 o'clock the household had assembled, or rather, it had materialized, the various inhabitants of Hartley House gravitating toward the sitting-room the way iron filings move toward a magnet, drawn by something they could not quite name. Miss Marple, who had been invited by Eleanor to stay for a cup of tea, and had accepted with the quiet decisiveness of someone who intends to stay rather longer than that, observed them all carefully. There was Oliver Hartley, the colonel's nephew, who arrived from upstairs wearing yesterday's clothes, and the expression of a man whose sleep had been interrupted, not by grief, but by something more calculating. He was 34, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with his uncle's prominent jaw softened by his mother's more uncertain features. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the covered shape on the floor. The police had arranged a sheet with the practiced tidiness of people accustomed to such things, and something moved across his face. Relief, Miss Marple thought, not grief. Relief, quickly hidden, like a candle pinched out between two fingers. "Poor old devil," Oliver said, and the words were correct, but the voice was not. There was a lightness in it that he could not entirely suppress. Miss Marple noted this and filed it away in that orderly mental cabinet she kept for significant observations. Beside him, appearing from the kitchen corridor with a tea tray that she appeared to have assembled entirely by reflex, people did in crisis retreat to the familiar, was Lily Saunders, the housemaid. She was 22, small and dark, with quick, careful eyes and the kind of face that had learned early to give nothing away. She set the tray down on the sideboard without looking at the sheet on the floor, which Miss Marple also noted. The others had all looked. Lily had not. There was something deliberate in that refusal. Reverend Aldgate had remained, which was both appropriate. A man of the cloth had certain duties in the presence of the newly dead, and, Miss Marple felt, not entirely motivated by clerical obligation. He accepted a cup of tea from Lily and stood near Eleanor with the solicitous attention of someone who has been practicing solicitousness for some time. Eleanor herself had sat down at last, in the armchair nearest the fire, and was looking at the middle distance with the focused expression of a woman doing complex arithmetic in her head. "I don't suppose," said Oliver, pouring himself something rather stronger than tea from a decanter on the sideboard, "that this means Christmas dinner is off." The silence that followed this remark was considerable. "Oliver," said Reverend Aldgate, quietly. "Well, I only mean—" Oliver waved his glass vaguely. "The caterers are coming at 2. Someone will have to telephone them." "I'll see to it," said Lily, and left the room before anyone could say another word. Miss Marple watched her go. Then she looked at Eleanor, who was still contemplating the middle distance. Then at Oliver, who was examining the contents of his glass with more concentration than they, strictly warranted. Then at Reverend Aldgate, who was watching Eleanor with an expression that Miss Marple found distinctly interesting. "Mrs. Hartley," she said gently, "I wonder, when did you last see your husband alive?" Eleanor's eyes came back from wherever they had been. "Last night," she said. "We had supper at 7. He went to bed early. His heart, you know, he tired easily. I sat up a while reading and then went to bed myself around 11. She paused. "I found him this morning when I came downstairs to open the curtains." He must have come down in the night. He sometimes did, when he couldn't sleep. He'd sit by the tree. He was fond of the tree, Miss Marple said. He decorated it himself every year, Eleanor said. Insisted on it, every ornament in a specific place. It was one of his fixed ideas. Every ornament, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, in a specific place. She looked at the tree. The fairy lights blinked on, blinked off, and in the place where a deep crimson bauble should have hung, near the top, on the third branch from the star, there was an empty hook. The ornament was still in the dead man's hand. Miss Marple looked at that empty hook for rather a long time. The others were talking, Oliver asking practical questions about solicitors and wills, Reverend Aldgate murmuring something about arrangements, and nobody noticed her looking. Which was, she reflected, one of the great advantages of being an elderly woman who appeared to be merely standing about. People looked through you, and while they looked through you, you could see everything. She thought about the ornament, about why a man who had come downstairs unable to sleep would be reaching for a specific ornament near the top of the tree, about what might be inside a glass bauble, a deep crimson one, thin-walled, the kind that was decorative rather than solid, if someone had chosen it carefully as a hiding place. She thought about Lily Saunders, who had not looked at the covered body. She thought about the expression on Oliver Hartley's face in the doorway, and she thought about Eleanor Hartley, who had spent 20 years in a house with a difficult man, and who was now sitting very still by a fire, doing the arithmetic of what came next. Chapter 3. What the ornament held, Miss Marple did not sleep well that night, but this was not because she was troubled. It was because she was thinking, and thinking, when one did it properly, required a certain wakeful quality that was quite incompatible with sleep. She lay in the darkness of her cottage bedroom and went through what she knew in the systematic way that she had developed over decades. Not dramatically, not urgently, but with the steady, patient attention of a gardener who knows that good work cannot be hurried. The ornament was the key. She was quite certain of that. She had managed. This required some maneuvering and a carefully timed request to Constable Webb regarding a misplaced glove, to observe the broken bauble rather closely before it was removed. The crack across it was not the kind produced by being dropped. It was a deliberate fracture. The glass sheared cleanly, suggesting that it had been opened, hinged perhaps, or cut, and then the halves pressed back together and rehung. Inside a thin-walled glass ornament of that kind, you could conceal something small, a piece of paper, a key, a capsule of some kind. The Colonel had come downstairs in the night and reached for it. Had he hidden something there and come to retrieve it? Or had someone else hidden something there? Something intended for him to find? On Boxing Day morning, Miss Marple put on her coat and walked back to Hartley House. Eleanor admitted her without surprise. She had the look of a woman who had not slept at all. Not the haggard, undone look of grief, but the alert, slightly translucent look of someone who has spent the night on guard. She made tea without being asked and brought it to the sitting room, where the Christmas tree still stood, its lights switched off now, its decorations slightly dusty-looking in the winter daylight. "I wanted to ask you something," Miss Marple said, accepting her cup. "About the ornament Reginald was holding. The red one." Eleanor's hands on her own cup were very still. "What about it? It was from the top of the tree, near the star." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. Had it always been kept there? Every year? Yes, Eleanor said after a pause that was perhaps a half-second too long. He always put it there. He said it caught the light best from that position. And did he purchase it himself? It was a gift, Eleanor said, years ago. I don't remember from whom. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly, as though this were entirely satisfactory, and changed the subject. She asked about Christmas arrangements, about whether the family solicitor had been contacted, about whether Oliver would be staying on. Eleanor answered all of these questions with the smooth competence of a woman who had spent decades managing a household and a difficult husband, and gave nothing more away. After an appropriate interval, Miss Marple asked if she might use the cloakroom, and was directed down the hall. She did use the cloakroom, but she also paused, on the way back, outside the door of the small study that had been Colonel Hartley's private domain. The door was not quite closed. Through the gap she could see dimly a desk covered in papers, a filing cabinet with one drawer ajar, and, sitting in the leather chair behind the desk with back to the door, Oliver Hartley. He was reading something. Whatever it was, it absorbed him entirely. He did not hear her in the hall, or if he did not look up. Miss Marple noted the posture of someone reading a document they had not expected to find, the particular quality of stillness that is not peace but the opposite of peace. She returned to the sitting room and had another cup of tea. Later that afternoon, she encountered Lily Saunders in the lane. The girl was walking quickly, head down, a bag over her shoulder, not the large bag of someone going on a journey, but the small bag of someone going somewhere specific for a short time. She was startled when Miss Marple spoke to her, and the startle told Miss Marple rather a lot. "I'm sorry to catch you like this, my dear," Miss Marple said. "I only wanted to ask, you've worked for the Hartleys for how long now?" 4 years, Lily said. She had recovered herself quickly. "Since I was 18. You must know the household very well." "I suppose I do." The girl's eyes were careful. She had the quality, Miss Marple thought, of someone who has learned to be careful from a very young age, and for serious reasons. "Colonel Hartley was. I imagine he was not the easiest of employers." A pause. Lily looked away at the snow on the wall, at the bare chestnut branches against the grey sky. "He was exacting," she said finally. "He liked things done a certain way, and if they weren't done that way, he'd let you know." The 3 words were careful and flat, and they carried in them, Miss Marple felt, the compressed weight of 4 years. "I see," said Miss Marple gently. "And Mrs. Hartley, she was good to you, I hope?" Something shifted in Lily's face. Not much, the girl was controlled, but something. "She was kind," she said. "She was always very kind." There was a world in those 5 words, Miss Marple thought. The kind of world that explained a great deal. She thanked Lily warmly, wished her a happy Christmas in the circumstances, and watched her continue down the lane. That evening, she received an unexpected caller. Reverend Aldgate arrived at her cottage door at 6 o'clock, holding a bottle of sherry in one hand and wearing the expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is trying to look casual about it. Miss Marple invited him in, accepted the sherry with genuine pleasure. It was a good one, and waited while he settled himself in the armchair opposite her and arranged his thoughts. "I wanted to speak to you," he said at last. "About Reginald." "Yes," Miss Marple said encouragingly. "I don't think his death was natural." He said it simply, directly, and then seemed to exhale with the relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy. "I've thought about it since yesterday morning, and I can't arrive at any other conclusion. The way he was found, the ornament, the fact that Eleanor was so composed." He stopped. "I've been a vicar for 20 years, Miss Marple. I've sat with people in grief. I know what it looks like. What I saw yesterday morning was not grief." "No," said Miss Marple. "It wasn't, was it?" He looked at her. "You've seen it, too." "I've been thinking along similar lines," she said carefully. I was the one who telephoned the police," he said. "But Craddock, he's already closed the file, practically. Natural causes. The post-mortem is scheduled, but he clearly considers it a formality." He leaned forward. "Miss Marple, I have to tell you something. Something I perhaps should have told the police, but I found myself uncertain about who to trust." "Tell me," she said. He clasped his hands together. "6 weeks ago, Reginald came to see me, not for pastoral reasons, for practical ones. He was frightened. He told me that he had found evidence. He didn't specify of what, and that he had secured it somewhere safe. He said that if anything happened to him, I should know that it had not been an accident." Aldgate paused. He said the evidence was somewhere in the house. Somewhere only he would know to look. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. Then she looked at the fire. Then she said very quietly, "The ornament!" "I thought so too," said Aldgate. "But it was in his hand, broken. Whatever was inside it is gone," said Miss Marple. "Yes, which means someone took it before the police arrived, or during the confusion of the morning." She picked up her knitting. "This is, as you say, a rather serious matter, and I think we need to understand something rather urgently. What the Colonel found, and who knew that he had found it. Because those two questions, Reverend Aldgate will tell us everything." Outside, the snow had begun again. It fell past the window quietly, steadily, covering everything with its impartial white patience. Chapter 4. A Will and Its Discontents. The post-mortem report arrived on the 27th, and it said, with the dispassionate clarity of the medical profession, that Colonel Reginald Hartley had died of cardiac arrest. It noted his pre-existing heart condition, his medication, the physiological markers consistent with a sudden acute episode. There was no mention of anything unusual in the toxicology. Detective Inspector Craddock telephoned Eleanor Hartley with the findings and closed the file with the satisfied efficiency of a man who has correctly identified a non-event. Miss Marple read the report. Reverend Aldgate, who had certain connections at the Downminster Constabulary, had obtained a copy and sat with it for a long time. Then she said, "Digoxin." "I beg your pardon," said Aldgate. "The Colonel's heart medication, digoxin." She set the report down. "It is a very useful drug. It keeps failing hearts beating with some degree of regularity. But it has the interesting characteristic of being, in excess doses, extremely toxic. And the characteristic of that toxicity is cardiac arrest. An acute episode, physiologically indistinguishable in many cases from the natural progression of existing heart disease." She paused. "Toxicology screens do not routinely test for digoxin overdose unless specifically requested, because it is already present in the patient's system. One would need to compare serum levels quite carefully." Aldgate stared at her. "You think he was poisoned?" "With his own medication? I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it is a possibility that warrants consideration. And I think that whoever controls the toxicology report and whoever has access to the house are the two things we need to think about." The reading of Colonel Hartley's will took place on the 28th, in the offices of Messrs. Fenwick and Beale in Downminster. Miss Marple was not present. She had no standing to be present, but she had a very good account of it from Oliver. Hartley, who arrived at her cottage door that evening in a state of controlled agitation that he made no real effort to conceal. "He changed it," Oliver said, without preamble, settling himself into the chair opposite her as though he had been doing so for years. 3 weeks ago. The whole thing. I was to receive Hartley House and a substantial portion of the estate. Now I receive a bequest of £5,000 and nothing else." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "Everything goes to Eleanor. The house, the investments, the lot, except," and here something changed in his voice, a hardening that had a quality Miss Marple recognized, "except a legacy of £20,000 to Lily Saunders." Miss Marple continued knitting. £20,000, Oliver said again, as though repetition might make it more comprehensible. To the housemaid, who has worked there 4 years. Did you know Lily before she came to work at Hartley House? Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Oliver looked at her sharply. No, of course not. And the previous will, when was that written? 8 years ago, when my father died and Uncle Reginald when it became clear that he and Eleanor wouldn't have children. He paused. I was the natural heir. Everyone understood that. Everyone, Miss Marple agreed. Including, I imagine, you yourself. I'm not ashamed of expecting what I was told to expect, Oliver said with some heat. He told me explicitly that the house would come to me, that the estate. When did he tell you this? Several times over the years, most recently at his birthday in September. Oliver stopped, which is why the change makes no sense. 3 weeks ago. What happened 3 weeks ago that would make him? He seemed to catch himself. Unless someone influenced him, Eleanor, or the girl. You think they persuaded him to change his will? I think someone did. He looked at her directly for the first time. Miss Marple, you've been at the house. You've spoken to both of them. Do you think it's possible that the change in the will is connected to how he died? It was a more perceptive question than she had expected from him. She considered him for a moment, the anger, which was real, but underneath the anger something else. Fear, she thought. Not grief, still not grief, but a new and recent fear. What are you frightened of, Mr. Hartley? She asked gently. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the fire. I found something, he said at last, in his study, on Boxing Day morning, while there was confusion. I went to his study to find the solicitor's telephone number, and I found, in the desk drawer, a letter, addressed to me, in his handwriting. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope. I took it. I know I shouldn't have, but I took it. Miss Marple did not reach for it. What does it say? It says, Oliver pressed his lips together, it says that he knows what I did in 2019, the business with the Marchmont property. He was silent for a moment. There was a financial arrangement that I made. That was not entirely. That had certain elements that would have been difficult to explain. Uncle Reginald found out somehow. He says in the letter that he was going to confront me about it, and that if I contested the new will, he had arranged for the evidence to be made public. And the evidence, Miss Marple said, was kept somewhere in the house. Oliver looked at her. In the ornament, he said. He always used to joke about it. Said the best hiding places were the most obvious ones. Something about hiding in plain sight. The ornament is broken, Miss Marple said, and its contents are gone. She watched his face very carefully as she said this. The relief that moved across it was unmistakable, and followed almost immediately by suspicion. Who took it? He said. That, said Miss Marple, is exactly the right question, and the answer to it will tell us whether your uncle's death was natural, because whoever took what was in that ornament had a very urgent reason to do so. And timing, Mr. Hartley, is everything. The ornament was broken before the police arrived, which means it was taken in that first half hour, when only 3 people were in the house. She looked at him steadily. You, your aunt, and Lily Saunders. The fire crackled. Oliver Hartley sat very still. I didn't take it, he said. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. I don't believe you did. If you had, you would not have come here. You came here because you're frightened that someone else took it. And you don't know what else might have been in it, besides the evidence about Marchmont. She set down her knitting. Tell me exactly what you know about the £20,000 left to Lily Saunders. Not what you suspect, what you know. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said very quietly, She's his daughter. The words sat in the room between them. Illegitimate, Oliver continued. My aunt never knew, or if she knew, she never said. But 3 years before Lily came to work at Hartley House, my uncle had a liaison with a woman in Downminster, a Mrs. Saunders' widow. She died when Lily was 17, and somehow, I don't know how Lily found out, she came to St. Mary Mead and presented herself at the door asking for work, and the colonel hired her and kept her for 4 years and changed his will. Oliver met her eyes. Eleanor didn't know about the bequest until today. I watched her face when the solicitor read it. She knew about Lily. Somehow she knew or guessed, but she didn't know about the money. And how did she look? Miss Marple asked carefully. When she heard. Oliver was quiet for a moment. She looked, he said slowly, like someone who had already accounted for it. Like it was something she'd prepared herself for and was simply confirming. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Outside, the 28th of December was darkening toward evening, and the snow on Church Lane reflected the last of the fading winter light. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said. "You have been more helpful than you know." After he left, she sat for a long time by the fire, thinking about a woman who had spent 20 years in a difficult marriage and had learned, somewhere along the way, to stop being surprised. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Confession. On the morning of the 29th, Miss Marple walked to the church. She went not for spiritual reasons, though she was a woman of genuine faith, which she had always found perfectly compatible with a clear-eyed understanding of human wickedness, but because she wanted to speak to Reverend Aldgate in a place where he felt at home. She had found over many years of conversation that people spoke more honestly in their own territory. The vicar in his vestry was not quite the same man as the vicar in someone else's sitting room. The church was empty and very cold. It smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the particular dry ecclesiastical smell of hymn books that have been handled by 10,000 hands over a century. Someone had placed Christmas lilies near the altar, white formal already beginning to droop. Miss Marple thought that lilies at Christmas always had a slightly funereal air, which seemed appropriate, given the week they had all had. Aldgate was in the vestry, going through papers. He looked up when she knocked, and she saw something move in his face. A brief, complicated something that he controlled almost immediately. He was glad to see her. He was also, she thought, relieved, which was interesting, because relief suggested that he had been expecting something worse. She sat down in the chair he offered and looked at him with the mild, attentive expression that had, over the years, extracted confessions from people far more guarded than a country vicar. "You haven't told me everything," she said gently. He put down his papers. "No," he said after a moment, "I haven't. You knew about Lily." A pause. "Yes, Reginald told me, in confidence. Part of the pastoral conversation I mentioned, when he came to see me 6 weeks ago." He was quiet. He was a complicated man, Miss Marple, whatever he may have been in other respects, and he was difficult. I don't shy away from that. He loved the girl, in his way, his very limited, controlled, insufficient way. He wanted to do right by her. He told you about the will change. He told me he was considering it. I think he wanted someone to tell him it was the right thing to do. Aldgate's voice was very quiet. "I told him that acknowledging one's responsibilities was always right, whatever the difficulties. And the evidence he'd hidden in the ornament, was that all evidence against Oliver Hartley?" Aldgate looked up. "How did you know about Oliver?" "Oliver told me himself, yesterday evening. He came to see me." She watched Aldgate's face. "Was there anything else in the ornament, besides material relating to his nephew?" The pause this time was longer. Aldgate got up from his chair and stood looking out the small vestry window at the frozen churchyard. The grave markers stood in their rows, patient and permanent, blotted with lichen and snow. "He told me," Aldgate said at last, without turning around, "that there was a letter addressed to Inspector Craddock, a letter that detailed certain facts about Eleanor. about her relationship with her physician. He stopped. With Dr. Haverford. Miss Marple was very still. He suspected them, Aldgate said. He had suspected for several years that Eleanor and Haverford that there was something between them. He had no proof, he said, but he was watching, and in the last month he had noticed things, discrepancies in his medication, pills that seemed to run out faster than they should, a slight change in his symptoms, nothing he could name precisely, but a sense that something was wrong. Aldgate turned from the window. He wrote all of this in the letter to Craddock. He wrote that if he died, Craddock should look very carefully at the digoxin levels and at the prescription records. And this letter, Miss Marple said, was in the ornament. Yes, along with the evidence against Oliver. Yes, and both are now gone. She was quiet for a moment. Did you tell the police about this when you telephoned them on Christmas morning? Nay. He stopped. No, I told them there had been a death. That is all. He sat down again. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely distressed. Not the managed distress of a man performing a role, but the real thing, the kind that sits in the chest and makes it hard to breathe. Because I was afraid, he said. Because I had told Eleanor, the night before, the night of Christmas Eve, that her husband had been to see me, that he was worried. I did not tell her the specifics. I want you to understand that. I did not betray a confidence. But I told her he was frightened, that he thought something might happen to him. He pressed his hands together, and the next morning he was dead. And I could not help asking myself whether I had, whether you had given her. Warning, Miss Marple said. Yes. The word was barely audible. Outside, a jackdaw landed on the stone windowsill, looked in with bright, indifferent eyes, and flew away. You must tell me, Miss Marple said carefully, exactly what you said to Eleanor. Every word you can remember. Because that conversation, Reverend Aldgate, is the pivot on which everything else turns. He told her. It took some time, and he was precise, a man trained in the weight of words, in the difference between what is said and what is meant. He had gone to Hartley House on Christmas Eve, he said, to deliver a small gift. A book of seasonal readings he gave to certain parishioners every year. Eleanor had been alone in the house. Oliver had gone to Downminster for the day. Lily had Christmas Eve afternoon off. They had sat by the fire and drunk mulled wine, and he had told her that her husband had come to see him in some distress, that he had mentioned concerns about his health and certain anxieties about the household. I did not say the word evidence, Aldgate said. I did not mention Oliver. I did not mention Dr. Haverford. I told her only that Reginald was frightened and that I thought she ought to be gentle with him over Christmas.
And she said? He was quiet for a moment.
She said, yes, Thomas, I know. And she looked at the fire. And I thought she meant she knew about his health, his anxiety. But now I think she knew rather more than that, Miss Marple said. She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, Reverend Aldgate, I need you to trust me. There are 2 things I need to do today, and I need to do them carefully. I believe Colonel Hartley was murdered. I believe I know how, and I believe I know by whom. But belief is not proof, and without proof, a woman who has suffered considerably may continue to have suffered in vain, and a murderer will remain at liberty. She stood up. I need you to do one thing. I need you to telephone Inspector Craddock and ask him, not tell him, ask him, to request a specific toxicological analysis. Compare the serum dioxin levels to therapeutic range. Ask for the prescription records from Dr. Haverford's practice. Tell him you have reason to believe the Colonel expressed anxiety about his medication in the weeks before his death. She paused. Can you do that? Yes, said Aldgate. Yes, I can. Good. She picked up her bag and her gloves. And I would suggest, she said with a mild smile, that you make the call from here, from the church, rather than from home. There is something about a call made from a church that tends to be taken rather more seriously. She left him there, sitting in the vestry, with his hands clasped and his conscience working through its necessary calculations, and walked back out into the cold white morning. Chapter 6. Lily's secret. Lily Saunders lived in the small flat above the old post office on the High Street, or rather, she had been living there for the past 3 days, having removed herself from Hartley House on the morning of the 26th, with the quiet efficiency of a person who had been ready to leave for some time. Miss Marple knocked on the door at 10:30 on the 29th and was admitted, after a pause long enough to suggest deliberation, into a sitting room that was bare but carefully ordered, every object placed as though the space had been thought about, rather than simply inhabited. Lily offered tea. Miss Marple accepted. They sat across from each other in 2 small chairs, and Miss Marple looked at the girl with the open, unintimidating attention that she had perfected over a lifetime. "You know why I'm here," Miss Marple said. It was not a question, and Lily did not treat it as one. "You want to know about the Colonel," she said. Her voice was steady. She had the composure of someone who has rehearsed this conversation many times in many forms, and has made peace with it. "I know who you are," Miss Marple said gently. "His daughter." Lily looked at her hands. "He told you?" "No, Oliver Hartley told me, though I suspect he knows only a part of it." She paused. "How old were you when you found out?" 17, Lily said. "When my mother died. She left me a letter. She'd kept it, everything. Letters from him, photographs. She stopped. She hadn't been deluded about it. She knew what it was and what it wasn't. But she wanted me to know who my father was. And you came here, 2 years later. I'd been in service elsewhere. I needed to know what to do with it first, whether to confront him or to just observe, to see what he was actually like." A very faint, complicated expression crossed her face. "He wasn't what I expected. He was harder, colder. The man in my mother's letters and the man at the door of Hartley House were not the same person. And I understood quickly that he had perhaps not been the same person when he was with her, either. But he recognized you. He recognized my mother's name. I gave it plainly. I said I was Sarah Saunders' daughter, that I was looking for work. He went very still. And then he said, 'Can you cook?' And I said yes, and he gave me the job." She paused. "He never spoke about it, not directly, but he left me alone. He never, the way he was with the other staff, he was never like that with me. There was a kind of courtesy, as though he owed me something and was paying it in that way, because it was the only way he knew." "And Mrs. Hartley?" "She knew within the first month." Lily's voice was flat. "She has very good instincts, Mrs. Hartley. She said nothing to me, nothing direct, but I could see that she'd worked it out. There was a day about 6 weeks in when she looked at me across the kitchen table, and the look said everything. And what it said was not angry, which surprised me." She paused again. What it said was something more like recognition, as though she was seeing something she had been half expecting for years. "She knew about your mother," Miss Marple said. "I think she'd known for a long time that there had been someone. She didn't know the details, but she knew there had been a child or suspected it." Lily's hands were quiet in her lap. "She was kind to me, from the beginning. It wasn't performed kindness, the kind people do when they're managing a situation. It was genuine. She saw me as—" She stopped, looked at the window, at the frost on the glass. "I think she saw me as another person who had been harmed by the same man, in different ways. And there was a kind of solidarity in that." "And the will?" Miss Marple asked. "Did you know about the change?" "Not until the reading. He never told me." She was quiet. "I didn't come here for money. I want you to understand that. I came to understand something about where I came from. And I found, not what I hoped for, but something, Mrs. Hartley, which was more than I expected." Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "Lily," she said gently, "I need to ask you something direct, and I need you to answer me honestly." On Christmas morning, when Mrs. Hartley came downstairs and found the Colonel, and before anyone else arrived, was there a period, even a brief one, when she was alone with him? Lily's eyes met hers. The girl was very still. "I came downstairs at 9:05, she said slowly. "I heard Mrs. Hartley's voice. I thought she'd called me. When I came into the hall, she was coming out of the sitting room. The door was open. I could see him on the floor. How long had she been downstairs before you came?" A pause. "I don't know. I'd been awake since 8. I didn't hear her come down." She hesitated. "Miss Marple, do you think she—" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that what matters is what happened during the night, not the morning. I think the important question is not what happened at 9:05 on Christmas morning, but what happened at some point in the preceding 8 hours." Lily was very still. "His medication," she said. "I sometimes helped him with his medication. Mrs. Hartley usually did. She prepared his pill box each week. But sometimes I would bring it to him, if she was otherwise occupied." She swallowed. 2 nights before Christmas, he was having a difficult evening, irritable, restless. I brought him his evening medication. The pill box was already prepared. I just brought it to him with water." She stopped. "I didn't count the pills. I never counted them." You just brought what was in the box." "Yes, and who had prepared the box that week?" Lily closed her eyes briefly. "Mrs. Hartley," she said. "Always Mrs. Hartley." The room was very quiet. From somewhere outside came the distant sound of a child's voice, high and cheerful, entirely unrelated to anything happening in this small, cold flat. "Thank you, Lily," Miss Marple said. She set down her cup and stood. "You've been very brave and very honest. Both of those things matter a great deal more than you perhaps know." She paused at the door. "I would ask you not to leave St. Mary Mead for the next few days, not because you are suspected of anything, but because I may need to speak with you again, and because, frankly, I think you have more reason than you know to want the truth to come out." Lily looked at her. "Do you know what happened?" she asked. "I believe I do," said Miss Marple. "Yes." She paused. "I have known, in a general sense, since Christmas morning. The specific details took somewhat longer, but the broad shape of it, yes." She looked at the girl with a very particular expression, part sorrow and part the long-worn steadiness of someone who has looked at human wickedness too many times to be shattered by it, but not so many times as to have stopped caring. The hardest part is not working out who did something terrible. The hardest part is understanding why a person who was not terrible, not essentially, became someone who did. She left Lily sitting in her chair, looking at the frost on the window, thinking about that. Chapter 7. Dr. Haverford's Dilemma. Miss Marple went to see Dr. Haverford at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 29th, without warning and without pretense. He lived in a handsome red brick house on the edge of the village. Not the surgery, which was a separate building, but his private residence, where he was spending the Christmas holiday with what appeared, from the outside, to be the careful orderliness of a man who has arranged his life with some deliberateness. There were Christmas lights in the window, a wreath on the door. The wreath struck Miss Marple as particularly interesting because it was the wrong kind for the house, too elaborate, too expensive, with dried orange slices and ribbon and varieties of fur that did not grow locally. It was the kind of wreath that was bought, she thought, rather than made. It had been purchased from somewhere that sold things to people who wanted to give an impression rather than convey a feeling. Dr. Haverford answered the door himself, which told her that he had no guests. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had been watching for. Foreknowledge. Not surprise. Not the mild inquiry of a man confronted with an unexpected visitor. He knew why she was here, or he suspected it, which amounted to the same thing. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good afternoon, Doctor. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wondered if I might have a few minutes of your time." He stood in the doorway for one long moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. They sat in his study, which was a room of books and professional journals, and the kind of cultivated order that speaks of a man who values control. He offered her nothing, a small discourtesy that was itself informative, and sat behind his desk with his hands folded, waiting. "I imagine,"
Miss Marple said pleasantly,
"that you've been expecting a conversation of this kind." "I don't know what conversation you're expecting to have, Miss Marple." "I think you do. I think you have been waiting for it since Christmas morning." She looked at him steadily. "You were at Hartley House a great deal this past year. More than a patient's condition strictly required. I have spoken to a number of people in the village, and the picture that emerges is of a physician who was attentive, perhaps unusually so." Hapford said nothing. "Eleanor Hartley is a remarkable woman," Miss Marple continued. "She has managed a very difficult marriage with great dignity for a very long time. And I think she met you and found something she had not had for 20 years. Someone who saw her clearly and valued what they saw." She paused. "I am not, to be entirely clear, condemning that. I am simply establishing what was. You have no evidence of anything improper," Haverford said. His voice was controlled, but the edges of it were not. "That is true," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is not evidence of an affair that concerns me. It is evidence of something rather more serious." She looked at him carefully.
Reginald Hartley suspected. He noted discrepancies in his medication, pills that ran low faster than they should.
He noticed changes in his symptoms. He wrote these things down. He placed them in a letter inside an ornament on his Christmas tree. That letter is now gone." She paused. "The question I am asking myself is whether the letter was taken before or after death." A muscle moved in Haverford's jaw. "I don't know what you think you know." "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you prepared the post-mortem report with the knowledge that you did not want certain tests performed. I think that you have been visiting this house with a dual purpose for some months. And I think that you are, at this moment, sitting in that chair and calculating whether I have enough to go to the police, and what the consequences would be if I did." She held his gaze. "Let me tell you what I think the calculation should be. Inspector Craddock has been asked, this morning, to request a supplementary toxicological analysis specific to digoxin serum levels compared against therapeutic range, and to examine prescription records from your surgery for the past 6 months." She paused. "Those records exist, Doctor. They don't disappear simply because a report has been filed." The silence was long and very complete. "I didn't kill him," Haverford said at last. The words came out with the quality of something that had been held under pressure and was now emerging, not because it had been chosen, but because it could no longer be contained. "Whatever you think, I did not give him the medication. I did not touch his pill box. That is the truth." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. He looked at her sharply. "I believe you," she repeated, "because I know who did, and it was not you." She paused. "But you knew about it. Afterwards, if not before. When you came on Christmas morning and examined the body, you had certain information that shaped what you wrote. You wrote what protected her, didn't you?" The silence was his answer. "You love her," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "You have loved her for some time, and she has had a very hard life, and you found it not difficult to look the other way, to write a report that said what everyone expected it to say." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand the human impulse, Dr. Haverford. I genuinely do. It does not require unusual wickedness to do what you did. It requires only the quite ordinary human willingness to protect someone you love at the cost of the truth." She paused. "But the truth has a way of not staying where you put it. Reginald Hartley understood that, which is why he hid things in an ornament. And you understand it too, I think. Which is why you have not slept well since Christmas morning." Haverford put his elbows on the desk and pressed his face into his hands. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was simply a man who had been holding himself upright for 4 days, finally finding he no longer had the architecture for it. "What happens now?" he said from behind his hands. "Now," said Miss Marple, "I go and speak with Eleanor. And you, I think you ring Inspector Craddock this evening and tell him that you have concerns about the completeness of your initial report, that new information has come to your attention, that you believe a more thorough toxicological analysis should be requested." She stood. "That is the path, Dr. Haverford, that leads to, not exoneration. No, I cannot promise that, but to the diminishment of your culpability. You did not commit the act. You concealed the evidence of it. Those are different things, and the law treats them differently." She moved toward the door, then paused. "And I would suggest that when the police come to speak with you, as they will, you tell them everything. Every conversation, every visit to the house, everything. The truth, at this stage, is your only remaining asset." She left him there, in his ordered study with its journals and its controlled surfaces, and walked back out into the pale late-afternoon winter light, thinking about what she was going to say to Eleanor Hartley. She had known, since Christmas morning, the shape of what had happened. But knowing a thing and doing what it required were two different exercises, and the second was harder than the first by a very considerable margin. Eleanor Hartley was not a villain. She was not a cold or wicked woman. She was a woman who had endured for 20 years what should not have had to be endured, and who had done at the end the terrible thing that such endurance sometimes produces. Miss Marple had seen it before. She had seen it in St. Mary Mead and in London, and in places whose names she had half forgotten. The long patience that breaks. The day when a person who has absorbed too much cruelty, too much humiliation, too many years of diminishment, reaches a limit that they did not know they had until they reached it. She was not going to Eleanor Hartley to condemn her. She was going because justice required it, and because she had, over 80-some years, come to believe that justice, even when it hurt, was ultimately a form of care. Chapter 8. Eleanor Speaks. The sitting room at Hartley House was different on the afternoon of the 29th. The Christmas tree was still there, but someone had unplugged the fairy lights. It stood in the corner now in its natural state, dark and faintly dusty, the ornaments dull without illumination. The fire was lower than it had been on previous visits. The curtains were partially drawn. The room had the atmosphere of a place that is in the process of becoming something other than what it was. Eleanor Hartley was sitting where she always sat, in the armchair by the fire, and she was reading. When Miss Marple entered, the door had been opened by Oliver, who appeared to be making himself busy in the kitchen for reasons best known to himself. Eleanor looked up from her book and then closed it and set it on the side table with a gesture that conveyed both resignation and, Miss Marple thought, a strange form of readiness. "Jane," she said. She had begun using the first name sometime in the past 4 days, which Miss Marple noted. "Eleanor," said Miss Marple. She sat down in the opposite chair without being invited. "I think you know why I've come." "I think so," Eleanor said. Her voice was very calm. She was wearing a gray dress and no jewelry, and she looked stripped of the social performance that had always been part of her presentation, older than she usually appeared, and also, paradoxically, more herself, more actual. "I spoke to Dr. Haverford this afternoon," Miss Marple said, "and to Lily, and to Reverend Aldgate, and to Oliver some days ago." She paused. "I have a reasonably complete picture." Eleanor nodded once. "The digoxin," Miss Marple said. "Yes." The word was simple and unqualified. Eleanor looked at the fire. "I knew what the levels would do." "Frederick, Doctor." "Haverford." had explained it to me some months ago in the context of Reginald's condition. What the medication did, what an excess would do, how it would present, she paused. He did not explain it for that reason. He explained it because I asked questions and he answered them. He did not know. He genuinely did not know what I would do with that information. Her voice was steady, but not emotionless. There was something in it that was not quite grief and not quite remorse. Something more complex than either. The feeling of a person who has done a thing they cannot undo, and who has stopped pretending to themselves that they wish they hadn't. "The pill box," Miss Marple said. "I prepared it every week. Have done for 2 years, since his condition worsened. He couldn't always remember, or he wouldn't always remember, which amounts to the same thing." She was quiet. "The week before Christmas, I added to his evening doses, not all at once, gradually. The effect is cumulative," that was what Frederick had explained, without knowing why I wanted to know. "The toxicity builds over time. By Christmas morning," she stopped. "He came downstairs in the night," Miss Marple said. "I heard him at about 2 o'clock. I lay still. I could hear him moving about. He sometimes did when he couldn't sleep. I heard him go to the sitting room, and then nothing for a while, and then nothing." She looked at her hands. "I came down at 7. He was on the floor beneath the tree. He was already gone." "The ornament," Miss Marple said. Eleanor's expression shifted. "I knew about the ornament. He had mentioned it to me once, some years ago, in the way that he mentioned things, which was as a form of threat rather than a confidence. He liked you to know that he held things over you. He had told me there were documents in that ornament that I should not care to have made public, about various. He had assembled evidence of a number of things over the years. About Oliver, which I knew about in outline. About me, which," she paused, "he suspected Frederick and me. He was right to suspect. There was nothing. There has been nothing improper. But there was an attachment, yes. An emotional attachment that Reginald correctly identified and used as a means of keeping me in place." She met Miss Marple's eyes. "You must understand what this house was, Jane. What the last 20 years were. I am not asking for absolution. I'm simply asking you to understand it fully." "I do understand it," Miss Marple said, "and meant it." "He was cruel," Eleanor said. "Not in ways that left marks. That kind of cruelty is harder to explain because there are no marks. It's the other kind. The kind that works in language and silence and small daily humiliations. The kind that wears you down until you can barely remember that you were once a different person." She was quiet for a moment. "When Frederick came, when I found that there was someone who looked at me and did not find me pathetic or invisible or something to be managed, I understood how diminished I had become. That understanding was both the best and the worst thing that happened to me in 20 years. "And you made a decision," Miss Marple said. "I made a decision," Eleanor said slowly, "over several months. It did not feel, I want to be honest about this, it did not feel like a decision about murder. It felt like a decision about endurance, about how much more could be endured and what happened when the answer became nothing." The room was very still. The fire settled, sending up a brief shower of sparks. "I took the ornament," Eleanor said. "On Christmas morning before anyone came, I broke it open. The documents inside were what he had threatened me with. Evidence of my friendship with Frederick. And the letter to Inspector Craddock. I burned them in the kitchen fireplace before Reverend Aldgate arrived." She paused. "I did not see the material about Oliver until later. I had not read it, simply burned it. If I had read it, I might have, but it doesn't matter now." "Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, "I have to tell you what I've put in motion. Inspector Craddock will be requesting a supplementary toxicological analysis. Dr. Haverford is going to contact him this evening. The prescription records will be examined. The evidence, while not conclusive, will be suggestive, I think. She held Eleanor's gaze. "There will be an investigation. I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry, but I could not." "I know," Eleanor said. "I know you couldn't. I have known, since Christmas morning, that this was coming. I have been preparing myself." She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not quite forgiveness and not quite accusation, but contained elements of both. "I know what you are, Jane. What you do. I knew when you walked through my door on Christmas morning, and I made the choice to let you stay." Miss Marple looked at her. "Why?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was tired," she said at last. "Because I had been carrying it alone since Christmas morning, and the weight of it was. And because I thought that perhaps—" She stopped. "Because I thought that perhaps someone who understood people as well as you do might also understand why, even if understanding why changes nothing about what must happen." "I do understand why," Miss Marple said, "and it does not change what must happen. Both of those things are true." Eleanor nodded. She looked at the fire. "I'll telephone my solicitor," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that would be wise." She stayed for another half-hour, not because there was anything more to be said, but because it seemed wrong to leave immediately. She sat with Eleanor by the dying fire, and they did not talk about what had been discussed, but about small things, the village, the coming year, a garden that would need attention in spring. It was a strange conversation, one of the strangest Miss Marple had ever had, and she was aware throughout of something that was not peace, but was adjacent to it. The quality of two women at the end of something, sitting together in the knowledge that it is over. When she finally left and walked back down Church Lane in the early darkness of a December evening, the lights of the village were coming on one by one, amber and warm, casting soft pools of color on the snow. A bell began, somewhere, the church tower, marking the hour. Miss Marple walked home and put the kettle on and sat by her own fire with her knitting, and was quiet for a very long time. Chapter 9. The long work of Truth Inspector Craddock arrived in St. Mary Mead on the 30th, and this time he arrived without the air of a man who has been inconvenienced by a non-event. He arrived early in the cold grey morning, with a sergeant, and with a particular quality of attention that had been absent from his first visit. Miss Marple watched him cross the lane from her window, and thought that there was something almost hopeful in this. That a man who had been wrong could come back and be right. That being wrong the first time was not the permanent shape of things. He came to see her first, which she had not expected. She had expected him to go directly to Hartley House, but instead he appeared at her door at 8:30, hat in hand, and asked if he might have a few minutes. "I owe you an explanation," he said, sitting down across from her with his large hands on his knees. "Or perhaps an apology. I'm not entirely sure which." "Neither is necessary," Miss Marple said. "You proceeded on the information available to you at the time. The information was incomplete. That is not the same as negligence." He looked at her with the slightly wary respect of a man who has been told he is not being blamed and is not entirely sure he believes it. "Dr. Haverford telephoned last night," he said, "and Reverend Aldgate telephoned yesterday morning, as I believe you suggested he should." He paused. "The supplementary analysis came through this morning. The serum digoxin levels were nearly twice the upper therapeutic limit, which, in a patient with his degree of cardiac compromise, would have been fatal," Miss Marple said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And the prescription records show that refills were being collected slightly ahead of schedule over the past 2 months. Small amounts, not dramatic, but consistently." He paused. "Which means someone in the household was using the medication faster than the prescribed rate, or accumulating it," Miss Marple said. He looked at her. "Or accumulating it," he agreed. He paused. "How long have you known?" "I had a working hypothesis by Christmas afternoon," she said. Confirmation has come gradually over the past several days.
She looked at him steadily. I want to be clear about one thing, Inspector. This is a case in which the facts are not in serious dispute.
The question of what happened is largely settled. The question of why, and of the circumstances that produced it. Those require your judgment and not mine. I would only ask that the full circumstances be placed before whoever eventually has to decide these things. The 20 years, the nature of the marriage, all of it. You think it matters, he said. I think it is part of the truth, she said, and I believe in complete truths. Half a truth is a kind of lie. Craddock nodded slowly. I'll want a full statement from you, and from Reverend Aldgate, and from the girl, Lily Saunders. He paused. Haverford he'll be subject to a professional inquiry, almost certainly. He falsified a death report. He did, Miss Marple agreed, and he knew he was doing it, and he did it out of love for someone who was suffering. That, too, is part of the complete picture. It doesn't excuse it. No, but it explains it, which is not the same thing. She paused. Inspector, will you tell me something? When you read the initial report and came to your initial conclusion, was there any moment, any small thing, that troubled you? He considered this for a long moment. The ornament, he said at last, the broken ornament in his hand. I thought, a man who comes downstairs at 2 a.m, who is feeling unwell, who perhaps knows he is dying, why would he reach for an ornament near the top of the tree? Why would that be his instinct? He paused, but I talked myself out of it. I said it was incidental, that people do strange things when they're confused and frightened. He looked at her. I should not have talked myself out of it. No, said Miss Marple, but the impulse to explain things simply, to close things and move on, is a very human impulse. We all have it. The useful thing is to notice when you're using it to avoid something difficult, rather than to navigate something. Straightforward. After Craddock left, he had work to do, and he was a man who did his work. Miss Marple sat for a while with a fresh pot of tea and thought about the case in the way she always did at the end. Not with the analytical attention of the investigation, but with a quieter, sadder attention, the kind that acknowledged the cost. Oliver Hartley would face questions about the Marchmont property. The documents in the ornament might have been burned, but financial records were not so easily destroyed. He would have difficulty, though perhaps not ruin. He was resilient in the calculating way of people who have always looked after themselves. He would manage. Lily Saunders would inherit £20,000 from a father she had come to know too late and imperfectly, and she would go on, to somewhere, to something. She had a toughness that had been built by difficulty and would sustain her. Miss Marple thought she would be all right, eventually, in the way that resilient young people are all right eventually. Not undamaged, but functional. Reverend Aldgate would carry what he carried. The guilt of the Christmas Eve conversation, the role he had played without knowing he had played it, for the rest of his life. He was a good man, and good men suffer their mistakes more thoroughly than bad ones. Miss Marple hoped he would find some peace in it eventually. The road to absolution for a clergyman was presumably a well-marked one, though she imagined the walking of it was no easier for the signposts. Dr. Haverford would face a professional inquiry. Whether he would practice again was uncertain. He would certainly face significant consequences. Whether he and Eleanor would. But no, that was too far ahead. There were closer and harder things to come first. And Eleanor, who had been patient for 20 years beyond the reasonable limit of patience, and had done the terrible thing, and was now sitting in her house waiting for the knock on the door that would begin the formal accounting for it. Miss Marple thought about her and felt the specific sorrow she always felt at the end of these things. Not for the fact of justice. Justice was necessary and right, but for the waste. the accumulated waste of years and possibilities, and the person Eleanor Hartley might have been had the years been different. She picked up her knitting. Outside, the village was going about its quiet post-Christmas business. The shops opening again, the school children not yet back but the adults resuming their routines. Snow was still on the ground, but the sky was lighter today, a pale winter blue rather than the heavy gray of the past week. A blackbird had replaced the robin in the garden, and was digging with great concentration in a patch of earth near the rose bed. Miss Marple watched it and thought that the world continued, as it always did, with its own indifferent beauty, through all the human difficulty that happened in it. That was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was a true one. And truth, complete truth, uncomfortable truth, was, she had always believed, the only foundation on which anything worth building could stand. Chapter 10. The drawing room, the last evening on the 31st of December, New Year's Eve. Miss Marple invited Reverend Aldgate to dinner. It was a small dinner, carefully prepared. A good soup, a roast chicken, a treacle tart that had come out better than expected. She had set the table properly, with candles, because she had always felt that candles at dinner represented a civilized defiance of the dark. And on this particular evening, at the end of this particular week, such defiance seemed appropriate. Aldgate arrived with a bottle of claret and the expression of a man who has been through something considerable and is not yet sure what he looks like on the other side of it. He had aged, Miss Marple thought, in the past week, not dramatically, but in the way that people who have had to reckon honestly with themselves tend to age. More lines, more weight behind the eyes, a slight slowing of the automatic smile. She respected this. Facile recovery from difficult things had always struck her as a form of dishonesty. They ate and talked of other things for most of the meal. The garden, the church roof fund, a book he was reading, a letter she had received from her nephew Raymond. These were not trivial matters. They were the fabric of an ordinary life, and the ordinary life was, at this particular moment, precisely what both of them needed to inhabit. It was over the treacle tart and the last of the claret that he said, "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I expect you will for some time. If I hadn't gone to see her on Christmas Eve, Thomas," she used his first name, which she rarely did, and he looked up. "If you had not gone on Christmas Eve, something else would have happened instead. The decision had been made long before that evening. What you said to Eleanor did not create the event. It may have influenced the timing, but the resolve, if you will, that had been in place for months. You gave her no new information she could have acted on. You were kind to her, which was what you were trained to be, and what she genuinely needed. That you were kind to the wrong person at the wrong moment is the particular cruelty of the situation. It is not a reason for guilt." She paused. "Accountability, perhaps. Reflection, certainly, but guilt of the kind that destroys. No, I would not wish that on you." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor has been very calm," he said, "since Craddock came. Her solicitor she seems almost relieved." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she is. That is perhaps the strangest and saddest thing about it. 20 years of a certain kind of life will do that. When the thing that has been impending, that one has dreaded and prepared for, finally arrives, there is a terrible relief in it. The waiting was worse than the thing itself." She paused. She will have a very hard time ahead, but she will not be alone. Lily is still there. Lily stayed. Lily stayed. She paused. "She told me that Mrs. Hartley had been the closest thing to a mother she'd found since her own died. That is, it complicates the moral arithmetic rather significantly. But it is true. And Lily Saunders is not the kind of young woman who abandons complicated truths because they are inconvenient." Aldgate nodded slowly. They were quiet for a moment. the candles burning low between them, the wine almost gone. "Miss Marple," he said, "how do you do it? How do you look at this, at all of it, and remain? You are not despairing. I look at what happened and I feel something very close to despair. And you don't." She considered this seriously, as she always considered serious questions. "I suppose," she said at last, "because I have seen it so many times. Not this specific thing. Every situation is specific. Every person is irreducibly themselves. But this shape of thing, the long unhappiness, the moment when it breaks, the aftermath." She looked at the candle flame. "And I have also seen, many more times in fact, the alternative. People who find their way through. People who are treated badly and do not ultimately reach the breaking point. People who are trapped and find the door. Those cases are less dramatic, and they do not generate the kind of concentrated attention that this sort of event does. But they are far more numerous. For every Eleanor Hartley, there are 20 women who found another way." She paused. "I try to remember that. I try not to let the extreme cases become, in my mind, representative of the ordinary human potential. Most people, given sufficient support, sufficient dignity, most people manage not to do the terrible thing. That is a very precise form of hope," Aldgate said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I find imprecise hope rather unsatisfying. It never quite holds." They sat together as the last of the year died quietly without ceremony. Outside, St. Mary Mead was mostly dark and mostly silent. There were no fireworks, no celebration, only the small, ordinary sounds of a village at rest. Somewhere a dog barked twice and was quiet. Somewhere a car moved along the main road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the curtains, and was gone. The church clock prepared itself, in whatever way church clocks do, for the announcement of midnight. Miss Marple thought about the year ending. She thought about Reginald Hartley, who had been a cruel man and a frightened one, and who had kept his cruelties in careful order, catalogued and filed, ready to be deployed when required. She thought about Eleanor, who had endured, and who would now face the formal consequences of having endured beyond the legal limit of endurance. She thought about Lily, who was someone's daughter and had found that out too late to be simple and not too late to matter. She thought about Oliver, who was calculating and who would probably survive in the way that calculating people tend to survive. About Aldgate, sitting opposite her now with his claret and his conscience and his genuine goodness, which was tested and would be tested further, and which she believed would hold. About Haverford, who had loved someone and had made a professional choice with that love as its motivation, and who would spend some years paying for that choice, while also knowing, in whatever private accounting he did, that he had not been entirely wrong to make it. And she thought about the ornament, the small crimson glass bauble that had hung on the tree every year, year after year, carrying its small deadly secret while Christmas came and went, and the village went about its life, and the colonel went about his cruelties, and Eleanor went about her endurance. There was something about that image, the decoration, the hidden thing, the beautiful exterior of ordinary life concealing what lay beneath it, that seemed to her, if she were being honest, less exceptional than it should. People concealed things in the ordinary always. The keeping of cruelty behind good curtains, and a well-decorated tree, and the annual performance of Christmas was not a peculiarity of the Hartley household. It was the oldest and most human of habits. Miss Marple had spent her long life learning to see behind it, not to shatter it for sport or for cleverness, but because the truth, the full and complete and uncomfortable truth, was the only thing that could make the ground solid enough to stand on. The clock struck 12. Midnight came to St. Mary Mead without drama. "Happy New Year, Thomas," said Miss Marple. "Happy New Year," said Aldgate. He raised his glass. "To truth, then, to truth," she agreed, "and to the people who have to live with it. which is of course all of us. She drank. The candles guttered in a brief draught from somewhere, then steadied, then burned on, small and warm and thoroughly adequate against the dark. Outside, the snow was still on the ground, white and patient and unhurried, covering the lane and the garden wall and the path to the church, and the turned earth of the graves in the churchyard with the same impartial care. It covered everything that had happened and everything that would happen, and in the morning it would still be there, not hiding anything, not revealing anything. Simply present, simply cold, simply what it was. Miss Marple finished her wine, thanked her guest for a pleasant evening, and went to bed. She slept very well. The case, as she would have said if anyone had asked, was closed. The truth, the whole truth, not the convenient portion of it, was in the hands of people whose job it was to decide what the law made of it. Her part was done. She had only done, as she always did, what seemed to her necessary and right, followed the thread, however painful, to its proper end. There was no more to be said about it, and no reason to say it. She pulled the eiderdown up to her chin in the dark, and the village settled around her, and the new year came in quietly and without fuss, the way the best things usually did.